Welcome to episode 4 of Objectively Biased. This is Wilder Adams alongside John Tortorelli, and today we have a lot of topics to talk about. So first of all, we're going to talk about why can't the 76ers be normal? Why can't they be normal ever, ever, ever? Next, we're going to talk about some young players, some winning, losing young players, and the development that comes along with that. We're going to talk about Bulldogs right here. No, we're not. But transitioning the Denver Nuggets, we're going to talk about their biggest issue, the Cavaliers' pitch-perfect 10-0 start, and some other miscellaneous thoughts. So, John, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing amazing. I'm really happy to be here today because we have some jam-packed topics, a jam-packed show with some teams who are struggling right now. Philly 1-7, things are starting to kind of torpedo for them. And then on the other side of things, at the end of the show, we get to talk again about some teams, not only the Cavaliers, but your T-Wolves and Anthony Edwards is building off last week a little bit. I feel like last week we talked about them, but maybe not as in-depth as we would like to per se. And all things considered, it's that point of the NBA season where guys are getting into that full NBA season shape. And it feels like the best product is right now before injuries come. So I really have nothing to complain about.
Yeah, there's really no complaints either, except the fact that he's trying to steal the attention of the show, man. He is so attention needy. But today we're just we're going to roll with it. And, you know, I've never seen a fan, dude, so disappointed about winning 4 in a row until I heard you talking about your team, the Denver Nuggets, man. What's with that?
We'll talk about that in a little bit. For me, it's really just it hasn't looked quite the same because the trio that really made the Nuggets what they were 2 years ago just hasn't quite played at that same level. And we'll talk about one of those guys specifically who hasn't really been the same the last 6 months dating back to the playoffs. But at the same exact time, there's some good stuff for the Nuggets. I can't fully complain because they got some young guys developing. And one of them I'm really happy about. I've been backing them up for a while, Christian Brown. But I think we're going to start off with the weirdest team in the NBA far and away. It's 76ers.
Yep, and before we go straight to the Philly disaster right now, I just want to say that, you know, today we won't have Rib with us. He couldn't make it, unfortunately. But, you know, I just think everybody's so busy right now. I mean, John right now, winning 4 in a row, being upset. Is that more of a product of the Nuggets playing bad, or is he just mad about all the essays he's taking? I don't know what it is, honestly.
Mixing both. Me missing the Heat game, that too. But we'll be back next week. And again, like Nuggets 4-game win streak has been showing some positive signs, at least. We're starting to kind of get back to above water. So
yeah, absolutely. And let's just talk about the Sixers because that team, they might be this year's Memphis Grizzlies, honestly. We're just seeing all the injuries kind of stack up right away. Joel Embiid, of course, and Paul, and the suspension situation now compounding that. Paul George, his injury recently, he just started coming back, but he hasn't looked great. And now Tyrese Maxey missing a couple weeks. And
at least,
if the NBA draft lottery was today, they would have the projected number 1 overall pick, which is not where they expect to be. So, John, besides the obvious, including the obvious, what are some of the biggest issues going on in Philadelphia?
I think first and foremost, when we're talking about Philly, you have to highlight how much they invest into this team, and specifically their trio. Because last year at the Phoenix Suns, I was high on them coming to the year because I looked at how you can build off of that foundation. But one of the things I noticed by the end of last year was when you have a foundation of $130 million going to Paul George, Joel Embiid, and Tyrese Maxey, you really need guys around them who can elevate. And specifically, having 2 of the most injury-prone stars of the generation kind of holds back the entire group because you look at guys like Caleb Martin, who have come in, Eric Gordon as well, and been expected to play in roles that they're not being paid to step into. And beyond that, I think an important thing to highlight at the start is that the 76ers don't have many guys on those quality rookie contracts. Tyrese Maxey is the one who's about to enter that new deal. He's currently on that. Outside of that, you don't have those guys in the Suns did like Ryan Dunn this year who can elevate in a role where it's a cost-controlled deal. Part of the issue with that is that, number one, the Sixers don't even have their first-round pick this year. So there's this added pressure for this to be the season where you start to put things together and go a little bit further in the playoffs. But I look at really having the slow start, and really what it comes down to for me is you're going to have a lot of ground to make up, of course, but more importantly, there's no chemistry to be built when Joel Embiid's going to have to wait until Tuesday to finally get back into the lineup, and now Tyrese Maxey's not there. And at no point for the first 2 months of the season or the first 6 weeks are you going to have this trio get to build that rapport. And I think we're working hand in hand with that is that Nick Nurse might be a slightly overrated head coach because I look at a guy like Caleb Martin and what he was able to bring in Miami. Eric Spoelstra made him one of the best role players offensively in the NBA for multiple years. And when you come to Philly, we're seeing him completely crescendo in his value, or completely dip to where he hasn't really been that valuable player. And I understand that Nick Nurse doesn't have a whole lot to work with, right? Paul George comes back into the lineup. He's looked better than what they've had previously compared to guys like PJ Tucker and Tobias Harrison's role, but Paul George isn't even playing quite well either. And I think for Nick Nurse, you're asking him to do a lot, but he has that expectation of being an elite head coach dating back to his days with the Raptors. And right now, what's really showed is that I don't think he's in that Eric Spoelstra tier where he can, without his top two stars, work magic and get the most out of a group kind of by quite simply having a great system. And when you look at the 76ers offense, it's rudderless. There's not much movement. It's the same exact thing we've seen the last couple of years with Doc Rivers and now Nurse. When it's not that James Harden and Joel Embiid pick and roll, it was a lot of guys taking shots. And right now, Philadelphia is simply not making them, making just 32% of their threes. So there's a lot of pressure on this trio, specifically Maxey, playing up to 40 minutes a game. And I think what we're seeing right now is that Nick Nurse is probably not the problem solver to kind of elevate the rest of this quality supporting cast. And I shouldn't say quality because you look down the board, outside of Gershon Yabusele having a few good games and Andre Drummond, there's really not anyone off this bench who you can trust for Philly.
You made a lot of really smart points there, and I just think it kind of displays the short-term reality of Philly. Philly is a disaster right now, plain and simple. From the injuries off the court, whether it's Paul George, Tyrese Maxey now, Joel Embiid, some of that stuff, the league already investigating on some of the load managing issues that come along with that. And now Joel Embiid pushes a reporter. You know, you can have your opinion on whether he made the right decision or not based on the content in that piece that the columnist wrote, but it just everything is compounded. Paul George hasn't looked great, but that's going to take time. And you mentioned it, Nick Nurse, he's had a weird set of circumstances, but the ball movement isn't there. The bench, I think their depth hasn't been able to stand out as much without your top end talent, and they have the worst record in basketball. Worst record. And you hope if you're Philly, these guys come back and they figure it out. But we now know for sure this is going to be pushed another 4 weeks with your big three, 2 to 4 weeks. It might be longer. I'm not sure. I think that was the timeline, 2 to 4 weeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it 4 to 6?
Maxey's timeline was at least 1 a week, but it is expected to be a little bit more. I think that's when it's being evaluated. So it could be up to 3.
So 2 to 4 weeks, I think that's what I saw. And so that acclimation process probably won't come until around Christmas. And Embiid's probably not playing back-to-back still. And let's just consider the reality. Philadelphia, Daryl Morey, this might be his last chance. And a lot of his chances is going to be reliant on whether Joel Embiid plays, whether Paul George plays, whether Tyrese Maxey plays. And there's going to be another added pressure on top of that because he's put a lot onto this team. He's had a series of stars who've come in and out of Philly, and they haven't worked for different reasons. Yeah. And there's a lot of pressure. This is late in Joel Embiid's prime. And if this is another disaster, is Joel Embiid going to want out eventually? We still got a long way until we get to that point, but there's a lot of issues going on right now that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other part of it, too, is when you look at the Sixers throughout their entire history, and specifically my time as an NBA fan, there's not been a more weird NBA franchise. 2010s, you have back-to-back first overall picks who, one, never developed an ability to shoot, and then at that same exact juncture, loses all of his explosiveness and has such little confidence and ability to jump off 1 foot that he's not even looking to draft to the rim.
Mm-hmm.
The following year, you have a first overall pick who looked like the second coming of Shea. I shouldn't say second coming because he was Shea Gilgeous-Alexander before Shea. What Markelle Fultz was in college was the next superstar offensive creator, someone who does everything. He has an elite score. But right after the draft, Ben Simmons, Markelle Fultz loses the ability to shoot because of nerve damage in his shoulder. And then the year since, Zaire Williams nearly passes away because of an allergic reaction at the team facility. And it goes on and on and on with one young player after another.
Zaire Smith?
I say Zaire Williams.
Yeah.
I did. Yeah. Zaire Williams been on my mind, apparently. Zaire Smith, also another young guy who they take in the lottery. They trade Mikal Bridges just to have him be that future guard, maybe someone that becomes a starter. And unfortunately, he loses really his basketball career at that same exact juncture. So just like the list of bizarre things that have happened to Philly leads us to this point where it's been basically an entire decade, dating back to 2014, where you've had Joel Embiid. In the last 7 years, you've been trying to compete, but this is clearly not going to be the year. And as Joel Embiid's 30 years old and Paul George continues to get older and less consistent of a star player, you look at an aging, very questionable injury-prone trio and then a supporting cast where you're not going to have your first-round pick this year to add a young guy who can bring that value. So I don't think there's many solutions. And that's what makes this year such a critical year to figure things out, whether you're the 6 seed or the 3 seed, and gain to the conference finals at the very least. And showing that, okay, in this Eastern Conference, you've got Boston, but the second spot is wide open, whether it's the Knicks or a team like Philly who has that top end star power.
So I'm going to ask a question that I can't imagine actually going into fruition, but it's a fun hypothetical to start with. Let's say Philadelphia is 2-13 to start the year. Joel Embiid is still getting back in. Paul George, not clearly right yet. Tyrese Maxey's coming back soon. You mentioned they likely don't have their first-round pick. I believe OKC.
Top 6 protected because of the Al Horford deal, which is another different thing. Elton Brand comes in because of Brian Colangelo. My apologies. And they give – not only do they give Al Horford a $100 million deal, they give Tobias Harris $180 million when all 3 of those players play in the same exact spot on the floor offensively. And their best floor spacer in that starting 5 was Josh Richardson. So that's another year of just bizarre, poor roster construction, compounding with unfortunate luck, Ben Simmons being out in the bubble. So, I mean, it really has been never ending. Each year, it's its own new story that could be a full chapter.
So my question for you is, if they fall really behind, they're 2-13, worst record in the NBA, nobody's clearly healthy. Is it better to just take this year off and get these guys physically right and have a chance at a top 6 pick, just the asset of a top 6 pick in this year's draft? Kind of like what the Spurs did in 97 with David Robinson, and they have the chance at a Tim Duncan. Is that the move if they fall too far behind? Because right now, the East is still really a lot of parity, a lot of 3 and 4 teams right now. But at a certain point, they might fall enough behind. Would it be better just to get your stars physically right and jump at it next year with a draft asset that you probably trade, but you might draft too?
It sounds like a great idea on paper. In 96, David Robinson broke his foot, underwent surgery, and then missed the entire year. And that's how they got David Robinson, how they got Tim Duncan in the 97 class, the first overall pick. It's a lot harder to do that, though, if Joel Embiid is healthy in the middle of the season, because at 30 years old, that is a league MVP. And around him, you have Tyrese Maxey still on that last year of his rookie deal. And then at the same exact time, Paul George isn't going to get any younger. So it does make sense just long term. But for right now, I don't think it's really something that Daryl Morey would decide to do, because
I agree.
As somebody who he's all about the analytical side of basketball, and he always, I feel like many years has dealt with stuff like this. Last year, his first year at the team, his second in 2022, where they were kind of losing ground a little bit because of Embiid getting hurt. Philadelphia, no matter what, is going to like their chances to beat a team in the first round playoffs because you have Embiid. And in most series, he's going to be the best player. The only case where he would be against Giannis. So I think it's very unlikely just because of the fact they'll take their chance in an 8 seed going up against Boston. I mean, it doesn't make sense. The 7 seed going up against the 2, they'll take that versus the Bucks. So I think it's unlikely, but it does make a ton of sense because then you get to develop some young guys by giving them more minutes. And then obviously, I think the biggest benefit is that you give Embiid a year off. In theory, he'll be more healthy moving forward. But
and Paul George,
I don't know if that's the perfect thing, though. I don't know if that's the solution for their injuries.
Sometimes I think part of Joel Embiid's injury issues has been he's hurt midway through the season, then he comes back too quickly.
Yeah.
And then in the playoffs, he's not physically right. And everybody's wondering 70%. If Embiid is a playoff underperformer. He hasn't been healthy in the playoffs 80% of the time. And sometimes it's because this guy comes back way too quick on injuries. So the value proposition is it better to come back with more assets, with more young development next year, with the year where just Paul George can just keep his body right? Joel Embiid, keep his body right. I think Tyrese Maxey is one of those players that you could be good with and tank with. He doesn't come off as, well, if he plays, you're winning 35 games. It doesn't matter.
Right.
So I don't think this is a very likely scenario because Daryl Morey has had like 9 different chances of trying something new and bold. It's, oh, I'm telling you, Ben Simmons, let's just trade him for James Harden. I promise this is the move. Oh, James Harden's not working. I promise you. Let's trade James Harden for pennies on the dollar to the Clippers for flexibility so we can get a max player in free agency. Oh, this isn't working because our max player's hurt. How about let's just let them have the year off and get a high draft pick? At some point, there might be
Right.
some fatigue with, I promise, the next move is the big one. That's probably why he probably doesn't have the time for that. But if he does, I think it makes a lot of sense to say, look, we're really far behind in the East right now.
Hmm.
Might be better just to assure Embiid is going to be healthy next year, assure Paul George is going to be healthy. We have our big three locked in for next year, and we have this asset, whether we draft it, whether we trade it, because this is a very talented draft at the top. It's
Right.
the Warriors did it in 2020, but that draft, even though LaMelo and Ant have turned out well, didn't have the reputation of a great draft at the top.
Hmm.
So I think it's something to think about. I'm just not sure if, you know, he has the flexibility with his job security to
Right.
make such a decision.
Yeah, that's very valid too. Because I think the only way it becomes reality, you start 2-13, and then Embiid misses 6 weeks. If he's
Yeah.
out for over a month, then you talk yourself into the way Steph broke his hand in 2020, then a pandemic came, which shortened the season. That would be the only opportunity for the Sixers because if you are 2-13 and Embiid's 90%, you're going to have to try to compete. And then more likely than not, you can catch up and get yourself close to 500 by the second half of the season. So
Ace Bailey is such a Sixer.
he would be a nice fit. I mean, this top four of the draft class, I think all four of those players will be all-stars.
Name those
And
four.
a lot of them are physically ready for the NBA.
Are you mentioning Igor Demon right now in that four?
I'm not.
Okay, then. All right. I think Demon's top four. We might talk about him later, but if anybody is watching and they're like, who in the hell is Igor Demon? Watch him. Just 6'8" point guard, playmaking magician. He has the Halliburton just ability to get everybody in stride all the time, but he
Mhm.
also has that like Rubio, LaMelo Ball type creativity and how he gives people the ball. And his jump shot's improving, and he's flipping 6'9". he's fun. He's really fun. He might end up. I wouldn't bet on him being a top 3 pick, but he might end up
Right.
being one because you don't find a lot of players like that. He's a way better version of Giddy.
A way
So
better version of Giddy is a pretty good NBA player.
he's good, man. I like him more than Giddy right now. He looks good. So, and plus BYU, they're going to go from Igor Demon, and I think they're going to get AJ DeBonsta. I think they're getting AJ
Really?
next year. So if they get AJ DeBonsta after Igor Demon, what's brewing in BYU, man? So I'm just hoping Igor Demon isn't the Zach Wilson of basketball. That's all I'm hoping for. But yeah, so let's transition. That was a little snippet of some draft trends. I know John is going to try to get more into the draft
I'm
groove
gonna.
before we start going deep into it.
By March, I will be.
But let's complain about Denver right now because John feels
Mm.
like complaining right now. So, John, tell me what's wrong with Denver.
Aaron Gordon being hurt. Secondly, I can't stand how much people propped up Jamal Murray after the 2023 playoff run for how fantastic he played. And let's be clear, he was nearly perfect. He averaged 10 assists in the finals, and he was that consistent playoff superstar, someone who, like a Donovan Mitchell, could be a close to all-star, like Donovan Mitchell's first 2 years in the regular season. But then once he gets to the bright lights of the playoffs, he's elevating to a whole different level because he has that gene in him, like a Joe Burrow, to consistently under pressure just over deliver. But since the playoffs where Jamal Murray was not 100% healthy, we have not seen him make shots. And you're going to talk about him in a moment, I'm sure, because I think you'll grab about him too. The Denver Nuggets' biggest issue has been they've been trying to save money around the edges throughout the last 2.5 years, or the last 2 years, I should say, with Nikola Jokic being smack dab in the middle of his prime. They've cheaped out on Bruce Brown. Michael Porter Jr. gets off to a slow start to the year. Why? He hasn't had one of the best reserves in basketball to keep him accountable and active on the defensive end. If he doesn't defend hard, it won't matter because there's going to be no one quality enough to take him out of the closing five. Michael Porter Jr. has played a lot better the last 4 games because he's making his shots, but defensively, there was a engagement and commitment level in their 2023 playoff run because they had a solid 6 to 7 guys Sometimes that was Christian Brown. Other times it might have been Jeff Green. But that was just enough with no injuries for that group to be a perfect collection of shooting, perimeter defense, passing, and connectivity for Nikola Jokic to have one of the best playoff runs I've gotten to witness. And I think the unfortunate part with this Aaron Gordon injury, which seems to be a month, and I'll double check, I'm not confident Peyton Wilson fulfilling that role perfectly. Peyton Wilson also has an opportunity to really showcase himself. And I look at this young core the Nuggets have, and the only person who has really delivered based off of my expectations has been Christian Brown. 17 points a game. He's making his shots, defending with that nonstop motor. Even then, he's taking 3.5 3-point attempts a game. And while he has been uber productive and more productive than what Contavious Caldwell Pope was, there still is that level of trust in a guy to make shots, which I don't think Nikola fully has in him yet. He is shooting 50% from three, yes, but it's more of a volume proposition where if you're taking 5.5 attempts, defenses are going to start to really pay more attention and close out harder. But one of my concerns, the injuries are catching up, and this team has no margin for injuries because they're full. There goes my microphone. This team has no margin.
Scare my dog.
I know. My table slid. I'll adjust that in a second.
Oh, man.
The problem is this team has no margin for injuries because of how much ownership has saved. And then I think in the same exact vein, we need to start having honest conversations about Jamal Murray because what he was propped up to be is far from the player we're seeing. And right now, it's really become clear that he's not an all-star in the regular season. And if he's not healthy in the playoffs either, well, how valuable really is he to this Nuggets team when you've got the best player in the world consistently year in and year out, leading the league in rebounding, leading the league in assists, averaging an efficient 28, and being everything while supporting cast continues to regress.
That's going to start out a point I have, and this is going to start out more as an appreciation for Nikola Jokic, because honestly, and this includes even Steph, this includes LeBron, I don't think there's been a player in 30-plus years who's been able to elevate teammates around him better than Nikola Jokic. Jokic just makes the lives of creators and spot-up shooters and even cutters just easier than any other player I've ever seen ever, and it's so impressive. And I think when Denver really started that run, they thought it was the core of Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. No, it's literally just Nikola Jokic and certain archetypes you need to fill around Nikola Jokic. Jamal Murray is the luckiest co-star in recent NBA history. That's simple to me because what Jamal Murray is, in my opinion, 25 other teams in the NBA, maybe not 25, let's just say 18 teams in the NBA. He's ideally a fantastic shot-making six-man. Jamal Murray has the capabilities to go off in the playoffs and have big moments. He has the it factor. But you know who also had the it factor for those big moments, I believe? I believe Jordan Poole had those moments for Golden State.
Not consistently, though. Let's be clear on that.
Even Jamal Murray, like he had a great playmaking finals and he had a couple big games in the playoffs. He was, as a scorer, a little up and down in 2023. I mean, he was getting, he averaged what was it, 34 one series, and he finished the playoffs at 26. So
in the bubble,
he only averaged 26 in the playoffs.
Yep. In the bubble, yeah. The first round series was
in 2023.
Series.
In
2020 he started off averaging 34 versus the Jazz. 32. Yep. My apologies. 32. And then the rest of the playoffs in that Lakers series, he was a bit up and down, but he still had some highs.
There are some players who, if you give them a situation where they play off of Jokic's gravity, I believe they would do some very similar things to Jamal Murray and have those just absolute volcanic moments, because there's more great six-man scorers who can do that than people realize. I think if you threw Kobe White right now on Denver next to Nikola Jokic with the creation he can have, and he's also somebody people don't realize, like end of his rookie year, he was averaging 25 a game post All-Star break. You know, he's had moments like that. Kobe White can go off like a freaking volcano. Jordan Poole can go off like a volcano. Prime Lou Williams, prime Jamal Crawford. I believe you put that archetype of player next to Nikola Jokic, they look like stars because they don't usually have somebody who can be played off of like Nikola Jokic. Right. And all they need is a little bit of space for that overwhelming confidence to really shake forward. And I think Jamal Murray, good NBA player, he's benefited a lot from the space Nikola creates, from the little heat waves that a lot of great six-man get. He has a lot of those traits, and I think it really exemplifies with Nikola Jokic. And I think if you put a lot of great six men who can go volcanic like that with that type of spacing, I think it compounds into star production.
But I do think a comparison between Kobe White, someone who's averaging 20 a game and shooting 40% on a high volume of 3-point attempts, that is a pretty comparable comp or a pretty fair comp to Jamal Murray if he wasn't on the Nuggets because he has the same exact skill set. I think he's every bit as efficient in a far more challenging set of circumstances. And he's also taken some time. Jamal Murray took about 3 years to really come into his own. Kobe White took 4. So I think it's fair to make that comp. At the
Yeah.
same exact time, I'm expecting Jamal Murray to start picking it up. But the concern is that this is something that's dated back to the playoffs last year. And people may wonder, how the Nuggets go from dominating that 2023 playoff run to really struggling in that second round series that they lost. It was number one, Michael Porter Jr. wasn't making the shots, but then two, a player who some people said was a top 7-point guard, like climbing up the top 5, was quite frankly the one hole in the Nuggets back in that series. Because when Jaden McDaniels was guarding him, he got zero separation. That tough shot making, which was really a consistent theme in those 2 other playoff runs, just wasn't something you can replicate at that size. So I believe Jamal Murray's going to get back. He's one of my favorite players, but I think the issue for Denver is when you have less floor spacing and Jamal's dealing with those nagging pains and the lower body issues here and there.
Yep, that's been a big problem.
It's just really not the same level of separation he's generating one-on-one, and it just puts more and more pressure on a guy to be somebody that he's not in Jamal Murray's case. And meanwhile, Jokic is playing every single game. I think the crazy part about this is while the Nuggets supporting cast doesn't seem like it's going to put him in a position right now to get another championship, he is continuing to play every single night at that same exact standard. And he is the lone consistent one as the superstar in this group. And that's what makes him, to me, one of like the most underappreciated superstars even still this generation. That like Tim Duncan light effect.
He's so flipping good, man. He's just so flipping good. Nobody creates space like he does. Simply put, Jamal Murray, I think, benefits so much for that extra 15% of space that he gets from Nikola Jokic. Because Jamal Murray can be a dynamic creator at times, but he lacks the physically dynamic nature, in my opinion, to consistently do it. He can get in these heat waves like a Kobe White can, for example, I think if Bradley Beal was put next to Nikola Jokic, I think people call him one of the best scorers of this generation. I'm not kidding.
I mean, Bradley Beal was averaging 31 for multiple years on some pretty poor Washington teams before Russ got there. And
I think Bradley Beal, he's a step above Jamal Murray as a talent. And Bradley Beal, people said he was a losing basketball player because they weren't winning games with him because he was asked to be that number one guy, and they didn't have a great roster around him, and he isn't a number one guy. But you put him as a number 2 next to Jokic, and he just gets to play with that space. Somebody who I think is just a better talent than Jamal Murray. I think people talk about Bradley Beal as a Hall of Famer next to Nikola Jokic. I'm not kidding. Like, I think Nikola Jokic has that type of impact on stars around them. And I think Kobe White, or I think Jamal Murray, somebody who's a good basketball player, I think that max all-star caliber maintenance type of player, I don't think he gets that anywhere else. I think Jamal Murray's got to thank Nikola Jokic a lot because Jokic himself, in my opinion, has made Jamal Murray over $150 million by himself. So,
I mean, they gave him a big contract, and that's also ownership saying we'll give Jamal Murray every dollar, 4 years, $208 million, but we're going to skimp out everywhere else outside of that top 4. And I think that's what goes back to, again, that standard not being set of a championship caliber expectation because you don't have quality enough or established enough young players to actually close a game if Jamal Murray's playing poorly. And he missed 3 games before the most recent one versus the Heat. Jamal played a lot better, and I'll give him credit. He was a plus 28 in his minutes, had an efficient game, but I feel like most often when championship teams start to fall off a cliff, and the Nuggets case, they're not falling off a cliff. They're 6-3 right now. Yeah. When championship teams start to regress and decline, the biggest reason why is they don't have young talent to challenge those older guys and eventually inherit the roles. You have one in Christian Brown, sure, but number 2, you don't necessarily have that expectation. If I play poorly, if I don't do my job, there will be someone that's going to take my place in the lineup to finish that game. And again, I think that's what made Bruce Brown so valuable. He connected everything, but while he was only playing a modest role in production, he played a critical role in elevating everyone else around him because there was that commitment to really paying attention to the closer details.
I have a question for you. as a Denver fan, how much of this decline and just lack of optionality is a product of Tim Connolly leaving?
Not much. It's ownership,
You think it's ownership?
first and foremost. It's Stan
Because
Kroenke.
they wouldn't pay Tim Connolly the money another
Right.
franchise is asking. But I mean, Tim Connolly isn't he the one of the 3 or 4 best guys in the league at just finding talent on the margins?
Absolutely. And I think Calvin Booth did do some of that. He is the one that went 1 for 2 and had a big hit in Christian Brown. I know it's only 9 games, but I'm expecting Brown to continue being a star player, like a good starter. And to get that 21st overall pick, massive hit.
Mm-hmm.
Turning Will Barton into Contavious Caldwell-Pope, great play. Signing
Yeah.
Bruce Brown on a 1-year deal was one of the best signs that entire offseason. So he's made a variety of very good moves.
Okay.
Connolly
Yeah.
had some right pieces too, but I'm not going to criticize Calvin Booth for the ownership not giving him the opportunity to re-sign some of these guys. I think with the hand that he was dealt, he's done an okay job. There have been some mistakes. The Dario Saric signing, this is one of the things that frustrated me. Dario in Oklahoma City and Phoenix was really good coming off the torn ACL. Last year with the Warriors, he struggled, and this year you give Dario Saric a contract to be a rotation player, and he's been unplayable. And I don't think we're going to see him the rest of the year. Zeke Nash, they gave him 4 years, $33 million. I don't remember which GM it was. It might have been Calvin Booth at the start. Zeke Nash is another one of those, like, he's supposed to be a quality forward off the bench who's going to develop in time, but he's dealt with injuries. He hasn't been able to make shots. And then at a certain point, DeAndre Jordan is like your 4th best reserve as you're counting guys like Julian Strother. And it may just take Strother some more time, I expect,
Yeah.
because he's still been solid in his role. Same Peyton Watson. So I don't think Calvin Booth coming in and Tim Connolly leaving is one of the reasons at all. I think it's ownership. And then also when you get to this point, you're going to have to start paying your guys. And then it's really on you to do a fantastic job with the last 10 picks of the first round. And they've done an all right job.
Yeah, I appreciate you educating me on that and kind of bringing in the ownership element because I think that makes the most sense. You know, I think most GMs would have wanted to bring KCP back, bring back Bruce Brown, those type of connectors. And I don't know if I know Denver's ownership has a reputation of being a little cheap, especially not wanting to pay their star GM, letting him go, not letting your KCP, not bringing back some of those key players that help put Denver over the hump, and just putting too much pressure on late first round picks to be good 1 to 2 years in, which a lot of those guys, if they make it in the league, it takes them 3-4 years until they're self-realized. So Denver's at a weird spot because now with your main 4 guys making so much and already the questions of if that core 4 is enough. Because today basketball, I think the league is just more talented than it was in 2022, 2023. Is Jokic going into his 30s with Jamal Murray, who's just been battling injuries for years now, with Gordon, with MPG, who also battles injuries. You compare that to what OKC's building, what Boston's building, what Minnesota's building, you know, like all these other teams, you know, who you want to be in that class.
Right.
That's going to be a big question.
Absolutely. That's why so often teams that get good fast struggle with not having enough. Whether it was the Mavericks in the early Luka days, he brought them to the playoffs by a year or two. It is the LeBron James effect, where you have a superstar, whether it's Jokic, Luka, LeBron. It could be Giannis, but it still took Giannis 5 years to become an all-star. That's 4 years of drafting in the lottery. You look at teams like the Thunder, who had multiple first-round picks for 3 to 4 years.
A number
Now
2
you have
pick.
6 to 8. Now you have 6 to 8 lottery picks. And then you're also getting building blocks through trades and just kind of blowing things up at a good time. So a large part of really having that freedom and flexibility is just being bad for longer. We talked about Philadelphia before. They did that. They just had terrible luck with all of the moves that they made. And part of that was because of self-inflicted wounds and poor decisions. But at the same exact time, some drafting and just hitting the right guys is purely based off of luck.
And I feel like Denver during those early Jokic years, they were kind of the team that was bad but not awful, and it felt like
decent offense.
They were consistently around that 7th overall pick range. Maybe sometimes later lottery they didn't have the boom. Let's draft Ben Simmons. Let's draft Lonzo. They didn't have that. They had Jamal Murray was their hit at 7th overall. You had the 14th pick, and it's great teams have to win and build rosters on the margins. Look at all the recent
Right.
champions. A lot of them didn't have number one overall picks or anything like that. So that part's true. But yeah, that's Jokic during those early Jokic years. It took Jokic. I mean, he didn't play his rookie year. He was still in Europe. And then he comes in, and they were not really good yet. They missed on Emmanuel Mudiay. So it's part of it, but they still had enough to get a title done. So I'm not really going to blame what they did in that late
Right.
2010s era. But
no, it ended up working out. They got Michael Porter Jr. with the 14th overall pick in that one year they missed the playoffs against Minnesota. So they still found a way.
That draft's so crazy, by the way. Even Michael Porter Jr. at 14 is really good value any year. But you look at some of the players who went behind Michael Porter Jr. in that draft. It's
Troy Brown, DiVincenzo, Zaire Smith.
Jalen Brunson, early second round.
Yeah. I was thinking the first few picks afterwards. But, yeah, there were some superstars taken
all over the draft that year.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a deep draft. Holy crap. 2018.
2018 draft is one of the best draft classes of all time. You have Luka Doncic, who – to me, will be a top 25 player at worst. I think by the time he retires, he'll be comfortably in the Kevin Garnett realm, and he could be even further. We'll see. Yeah, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is currently a top 10 player. Jalen Brunson, top 15 player. Trae Young, top 20 player. Jaren Jackson Jr., defensive player of the year. And then look at the quality depth. You have Miles Bridges, Dante DiVincenzo, Anthony Simons. I guess I'll group in
Colin
Sexton I missed with the 7th overall pick.
Even DeAndre Ayton, sort of.
DeAndre Ayton, sort of, but I'm missing one more guy.
I mean, you still have like Wendell Carter. You still had
Wendell, Gary Trent Jr. 3 years ago, I would have grouped Gary Trent Jr. in that group.
Vanderbilt pre-injury.
I missed Mikal Bridges. I said Miles and not Mikal.
Oh, I thought you mentioned Mikal. Okay.
Yeah, you're looking at like 10 high-end starters to superstars in that class, and then a bunch of decent role players like your Kevin Huerters, your Grayson Allens. I got like Anthony Simons is the 8th or 9th best player from that draft class. So,
yeah, that's pretty telling.
Yeah, and Anthony Simons is another one of those players. So I think you can make a case if he was in Jamal Murray's role, you'd get the same production.
Another guy,
very similar results. I think.
Yeah,
I don't think it's diminished Jamal entirely either, because he does have more of an it factor than many of those other guards, and just a higher motor and like that edge to him.
I think Colin Sexton is one of those 1,000% the it factor, but hasn't really been on the team to show up. If you put him next to Nikola Jokic, he might go crazy. I mean, Colin Sexton was one of the great scorers in high school history. He goes to college, he's dropping 40 pieces, comes in the league after just 24 his third year, and then he just, he's not huge. He's not a great playmaker. So his role started getting marginalized a little bit, but Colin Sexton can play, man. And you put him next to a guy like the Joker, where he doesn't really need to be that playmaker. I think he's good. I think he could be really good in that situation.
I mean, he's a complete scorer, but the issue with him is always that he played at one speed, and that was going full speed. And
Jokic can
anytime he drives, it seems like this is on the talk about on a Jazz broadcast. He never slows down to read and react. So it's just like one motion. I'm going to get a bucket, but I'm oftentimes going to have tunnel vision. I'm just going to lose sight of where I am getting there. And that's why the Cavs decided to choose Darius Garland over him, because he had just a more complete offensive game. And Sexton really is that example of pure buckets, not much else. It's like the Michael Beasley of the 2020s guard. But 24 a game before his torn meniscus. He's been a 19-point per game scorer his entire career, efficient, like very efficient shooting, 38% from deep, shoots right around 50% on twos. So, I mean, he is like a complete bucket. And if he's their sixth man, I think majority of teams would take that.
I agree with that. He's one of those players where if you put him in the right situation, and there's not many of those situations, I do think he can elevate. That's why I keep mentioning Jokic, man. I think he's the best player elevator of this generation, frankly. He and LeBron.
He's the most complimentary superstar of maybe all time.
Maybe.
When the three-point shot's going in. When the three-point shot's not going in, I think there's a lot of different guys.
I think Sexton plays one speed, but I think with Jokic, that wouldn't really matter. I really don't. So, I don't know, man. I think Jamal Murray's good. I thought when people said he was going to be this top 10 player, even in that moment, I thought that was hyper-reactive, because I think it underplayed how much of it was Jokic, who made his job easier. I don't know. I stand by my point. I think there's probably 10 or 15 players in the NBA who you could just throw in Jamal Murray's role that you wouldn't think about, and then it's like, oh wait, he might be a star when he might just be a really good player with microwave tendencies, but Jokic is there. But we've been on this topic a long time.
Yeah,
Um,
a good 15, 20 minutes.
yeah, we're
What do
at
we got
44
next?
minutes already. Holy guacamole. Um, okay, I want to go and transition quickly and just talk about some of the young players who've recently stood out. I was going to today kind of roast Cade Cunningham, but I'm going to give him some credit, okay?
Big game last night, huh?
Yesterday, Detroit almost blew the lead. They almost blew the lead. And Cade Cunningham has a history of bad fourth quarter stamina, getting brutally outplayed by other teams' best players in the fourth quarter, but he had a game winner and he had a block yesterday to avoid the big lead blown again. So I'm going to give him credit there. But I just want to ask you, is there any recent young player developments, positive or negative, that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I've got a handful. I'm going to start with one player who I've been as up and down on as you can possibly get on a former top 3 pick. That's RJ Barrett on the Toronto Raptors. Through 6 games this year, RJ Barrett has been one of the best passers and scorers at the 2 guard position. 26 points a game, up 8 points, 7 assists, over doubling his career average. He's taken a career high 7 3-point attempts a game, also making him at a 36% clip, which slightly above his career average. And then at the same exact time, with the full keys to this offense, for the most part, he has one of the highest usage rates of his career than any star player in the NBA. He's getting downhill, he's driving right, he's finishing right, and showing a little bit more growth and comfort, being able to really handle and navigate in the in-between space. The mid-range shot's still not quite going in. He doesn't have that pull-up midi. I've been waiting for him to develop, like a Jimmy Butler or even a DeMar DeRozan, who's one of the best mid-range scorers of all time. It's kind of a hard stare and set for RJ, but like a Jimmy Butler, someone who's maybe not the best three-point shooter possible to control games in that way. But I think for RJ Barrett, what's really standing out right now is in a new situation. I think playing at home maybe slightly helps. He's had a lot more freedom and opportunity the way he did at the end of that 2022 season, which kind of earned him that $100 million contract he got. I don't know how the 3-point shooting will vary it with the longer and the deeper we go into this year, but one thing's for sure, when he has the ball in his hands, he looks way more complete of a driver. And then the finishing, it's not more efficient. He had, I think 74% was what he was shooting at the rim in the second half of last year. The 30 games he played with the Raptors, he was shooting 74% at the rim. So you saw glimpses right now, or 72%. Right now, shooting 66% at the cup. 66% at the cup isn't very high for a wing, but compared to what it was at the Knicks, with Knicks, that was sub 60%. He was one of the worst finishers in basketball. So he was the definition of a player who had the skill set to drive and create space at times, but he never was making shots consistently at the rim. But right now, I'm watching him put defenders in his hip pocket, getting downhill, and just creating a little bit more space through better footwork and more confidence. And I also think, too, that the Raptors aren't a great offensive situation, but he's just getting that first step by guys a lot more frequently and using his upper body to kind of nudge defenders off him. So RJ Barrett's someone who to me has established himself as a real star player. And coming to this year, the question was, who's he going to be alongside Scotty Barnes? Well, you've got Grady Dick playing well with more and good opportunities. You've got RJ Barrett, who's really thriving in his role. And I think for the Raptors, there wasn't a whole lot to look forward to beyond Scotty Barnes coming in this year. But now we're starting to see that Masai Ujiri might be cooking something here. And I'm really happy to see RJ thriving back in his home country, because this was a young guy who kind of always had a better theory than reality. But I think we're starting to slowly see that change.
I love a lot of the points you made. I'm somebody who was, I wouldn't say I was like way on the spectrum against RJ Barrett, but I was definitely lukewarm, sort of moderately pessimistic on him. Like I was
Mhm.
open to
I was
him
open for him.
becoming a really good player. I had a weird relationship with RJ, but he, one of the things that I honestly don't wish for most young players is getting drafted by a top 2, top 3 market in the NBA. I think a lot of the time those kids come in, they're not as ready, and that becomes highlighted by the media, and then they struggle and they get labels even quicker than other players in Cleveland would get, or in Detroit or
Or
Minnesota, or
Utah.
all these smaller, medium, smaller markets. And then They end up going to a different team and they start figuring it out. Let's just look at the Lakers. Julius Randle, slightly disappointing in LA, shows some flashes. They let him go for nothing, builds his confidence in New Orleans, and then boom, he's an all-star in New York, and he's been an all-star for half a decade. Brandon Ingram looks like a bust as a number 2 pick, leaves, goes to New Orleans, becomes a top 50 player in the league, which didn't look like a possibility after a few years there.
They're
A lot of
comparing
these
him to
guys,
Scotty Barnes or Scottie Pippen by his third year in the NBA because he was playing next to LeBron James. But keep going.
yeah, he got false pressure. LeBron goes to the Lakers, and then it's okay. I'm just going to help these young kids, and then everybody sucks. Let's trade him for AD. Like that was the
Right.
thing. And RJ Barrett, he was one of those weird tweener players. I thought he was good at a lot of things, but not good enough at them for his impact to be truly impactful. He was never a good enough shooter to be a pure off-ball wing for Randall
Yep.
and Brunson. That wasn't meant to be. But going to Toronto, I think there's definitely a comfort being in his home country. His hometown. I think he's from Toronto. I might be wrong there. Going to Toronto and kind of having the free reign. Look, there's no pressure. We know the Raptors are bad. They're 2-7, but we're starting to see last year for a big sample size, he's giving you 21 a game on 60 true shooting. So this isn't even new for RJ Barrett. He's become a really efficient scorer. He's shown a little more craft. He's finishing better with both hands, really. And he's starting to show some ability off the dribble. In New York, he was stiff. He was upright, wasn't really finishing confidently, wasn't shooting confidently. He looks more free, and now the question is going to be, can RJ do this in a winning context where there's pressure? There's no pressure in Toronto right now. And I think we're starting to see him fully realize himself. Can he go back in a couple years with potentially another lottery pick, with Scotty Barnes, who comes back healthy soon, hopefully, IQ, an emerging Grady Dick, and can he be this all-star caliber player in a competitive environment? He's going to have to prove that, but I think based on the given circumstances, you can't be happier about what RJ's showing, especially in the last, honestly, 9 months now.
Right, because it was something we saw a bit in that brief stint with the Raptors last year. And I agree fully. With the Knicks, at first, when RJ Barrett was drafted, the first thing people thought is that he's going to save a sinking franchise that has zero foundation. And obviously, what happens in the year after is a pandemic. He loses a lot of reps there. And then quickly, the offense is shifted to Julius Randle. And RJ Barrett's biggest opportunity is kick out threes from Julius. That's not his game. So I largely believe that going to Toronto and relieving all of that pressure was a way for him to start to play in his role and what works well for him is to get more reps. At the same exact time, I fully agree. When Scotty Barnes is in the lineup, how well is RJ Barrett able to kind of play in the role of a Robin? Because a large part of that is shot making. And I want to see more of a larger sample size to understand, okay, is RJ Barrett a 36% three-point shooter from deep, or is he 34? And that's something we're going to find out with the rest of the 70 games to end this year. He's also from a suburb from Toronto, so an hour out.
Okay.
Kind of Toronto kid. I'm kind of a New York City kid, but I'm 30 minutes out. So
another example of a star who was in a big market and had to leave was Chauncey Billups as well. I was thinking of some other examples. RJ Barrett looks like an all-star talent in the future. I think he can make an all-star team if he keeps this up. We just have to see, like, he's kind of like you said, he's the guy who's running the show in Toronto. We know he's not good enough to do that in a contending context.
No.
So how well can he at least complement Scotty where they're playing off of each other instead of he's running the entire offense? I mean, the Raptors are 2-7. They're not winning with RJ doing this
they're
right now.
1-5 in the last 6.
So they're not good. So RJ, I think he's showing great signs. Now, can he continue showing those signs next to other good players? And I still, as weird as Toronto's been the last few years, I trust Masai to create a good core, and I like what Toronto has, but they're at this funny spot where they're expensive, they're not that good, and they haven't had their picks every year. And that's not usually a good spot to be in, but if we see some of these trends emerge recently and they get another good player in this draft and they start building good veterans around these guys, I think there's some decent possibilities for Toronto.
Absolutely. And the other thing that works hand in hand with this is, and it's kind of ironic, Scotty Barnes plays the first 4 games. RJ missed the first 4 games. And the 5 games, the 6 games that RJ Barrett's played, Scotty Barnes has not been in the lineup, and neither has Emmanuel Quickly. And I think that Scotty Barnes and RJ Barrett's play styles do somewhat clash because neither is really that high-end perimeter shooter. So it does put more pressure in the paint. You're playing these two with Jakob Poeltl and a big man that doesn't space the floor often. So how is he able to navigate with less spacing? That being said, Davion Mitchell's in the starting lineup some nights. And when
That's nasty spacing.
yes, absolutely. He's wearing number 45 too. And it's a little bit like striking me. Like he looks like Donovan Mitchell at times in Utah, either here or there. I think for Toronto, they're going to put better guys like Quickly and Grady Dick as well in the lineup to really support those two young guys that they're trying to build around. But the question is, how well do RJ and Scotty Barnes play off one another? I think they can do it with how well they both pass, how well they get to the rim. But I think from a pure shot creation perspective from the perimeter, the Raptors still lack that severely. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they develop. Scotty Barnes has his orbital fracture, and if he's out for the next few weeks, it's only going to do more for RJ to get more reps and more confidence until he does come back. So I think it's only going to kind of support his growth in these next couple of weeks.
I think they got a lot of solid young talent, but I think for years Toronto's been unbalanced. I think Masai wanted the experiment of having all these big, lengthy ball handlers, and it turns out Sam Presti actually beat him to that. Because Sam Presti found a way to get those guys who can also shoot, whereas Toronto just had Pascal Siakam, Scotty Barnes, and OG Anunoby, and then now it's turning into RJ Barrett, Scotty Barnes, and it's Toronto. They still have a lot of stuff to figure out. We just need more floor spacing around those guys, and we're still a couple years away, so they have time. I want to talk about Victor Wembanyama right now because my Victor Wembanyama stock has not dropped at all. Don't get me wrong. It hasn't dropped at all. But the way the media talked about how he was just going to walk in and just be a top 10 player after 2 years, it is so hard to dominate the NBA in 2 years. Most people aren't Luka Doncic. Luka Doncic is so physically polished. Victor, as much as Instagram photos are appealing sometimes, he is still a thin guy. And he has a lot of decision-making things to figure out. As a matter of fact, I'll go this far. Victor Wembanyama, Chet Holmgren's a better player than Victor Wembanyama right now. And the reason why I say this is because Victor Wembanyama, as gifted as he is, as high as the ceiling still is, he's going to figure it out. He still doesn't know how to get to the spots he needs to. He's not as consistent of a shooter that would suggest his play style to be. He is off the dribble. As fun and tight the handle is for that height, he still doesn't get to the rim off the dribble. He needs help from guards to get to the rim, which is why Chris Paul is a great addition, by the way. But Victor Wembanyama's shot selection and his decision-making polish offensively isn't where an offensive superstar needs to be. Victor Wembanyama isn't that right now. He isn't a great offensive player right now. Chet Holmgren doesn't have the talent Victor Wembanyama has long-term. But at least Chet Holmgren, better shooter, and he knows where to get to his spots. He knows he's not going to consistently beat you off the dribble, but he knows how to get to that spin to his left hand. He knows how to get to the simple push fade away. His shot off the catch is better. Chet Holmgren is a more efficient decision maker right now, and because of that, I think Victor's a better player. And people will say, Victor Wembanyama, put him on OKC. He's the same player. I don't agree with that because Victor Wembanyama has a maintenance that comes along with them because of how great of a prospect he was compared to Chet. So it's a lot more let Victor cook, let Victor cook, let Victor cook. When the reality is Victor's closer to Julius Randle as a shooter right now than he is Kevin Durant. And he's taking these brutal shots that affect his efficiency. And the stuff he wants to do, he can't do yet. And OKC would have him probably do some of those things Victor likes to do. So I just think Victor's decision-making right now is just he's not there yet. He will get there, but he's not there physically yet, and he doesn't know how to get to those spots. I wish you watch a lot more KG, get to that mid-range, take a little bump, and just pull up. Keep the game simple. He overcomplicates the game right now, and that's why I think year 2 is going to be a transition year for him, like CJ Stroud in the NFL. Year 3, year 4 is when we are going to see Victor Wembanyama cook.
Well, prayers up for CJ Stroud because that offensive line, he needs Nico Collins back. On this side of things, I disagree because Victor Wembanyama, to me, is a clear-cut defensive player of the year candidate. And I've got a stat which kind of blows me away. Right now, through what is this, 277 minutes or 8 games roughly. Opponents shoot 18% worse within 3 feet when Victor Wembanyama is in the vicinity. That's 99th percentile. Chet Holmgren's is half of that at an uber impressive 9% worse. Both of them are high-end defenders. I would say two of the best defenders of their position, and it's the most important position on that end. But Victor is a different caliber of a rim protector, and I believe because of that, it does kind of shorten that gap between them off the catch. And then Chet, as a rebounder, I think is maybe slightly better than Wemby, but I think you're kind of pulling hairs. It's pretty close. Wemby, to me, is just struggling because of the fact their entire offense is built around him. And putting a 7'4" combo center as the focal point of your offense with one of the highest usage rates in the NBA, but not a whole lot around him, is only going to hold him back. So I still believe Wemby's the better player, and he has a way higher ceiling in my eyes to be a shot creator. But I believe right now Chet Holmgren is the more serviceable player as a complementary option as number 2 because he is a elite shooter at the center position. And beyond that, he is every bit the finisher. And I also look at what Chet can do as a passer. And I believe that kind of makes him like the perfect number 2. Chet to me will never be a number 1, but that's okay. That's what you have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander for. So if he is that kind of co-star, it fits right in line with him being maybe perfect right now and more NBA ready. He is a year older as well. So I think expectations should be a little bit different with these two guys because of who Chet is versus Wemby's projection. It's not based entirely off of, is he a top 10 player off of year 2? And I thought that was a possibility. I'm not going to lie to you. I think right now he's probably somewhere in that top 30 to top 50. But I think long-term is really where you look at Wemby and say, that's where he will be defined. With Chet, it's more so he's one of the most NBA-ready rookies we saw. He had a year where he had to recover from a foot injury. So I think expectations kind of are a little bit lopsided. Say Chet's better right now, and that's because of the way he's playing. We should expect that, with Chet being really the most polished center I've seen in quite some time come out the draft.
Yeah, I'm not saying this is an indictment on Victor Wembanyama.
Yeah.
People walked in and said he would be an MVP player after 3 years. And I was like,
Mhm.
calm down. Victor's heights are as high as everybody thinks they are. But because Victor Wembanyama isn't polished enough offensively for what he wants to do, I don't consider him a legit positive offensive player right now. Chet Holmgren sometimes, and I agree with you, Chet Holmgren is way more serviceable as a number 2 than Victor Wembanyama because he is a way better connector, because he's a better shooter, because he's a more polished decision maker, because he's a better connective passer, I think, in situations that don't require heliocentric creation. Because of those things, I think he's better than Victor because he's better at the things that he can be as a number 2 than Victor is as a number 1. And I think the gap between what Chet can do as a number 2 is bigger than what Chet would be doing as a number 1 compared to Victor. Right. Because Victor right now, what is he at? 18 points on 42% from the floor right now?
22% downtown too.
I think that's going to go up, but he's never been an efficient three-point shooter before. He shot 27% from 3 in Europe, a little over 30% his rookie year. He's never been a great shooter. And until he figures out more ways to generate rim pressure, which shouldn't be too much to ask out of a 7'5" guy, and until he starts realizing that his game might not be best predicated on trying to be Kevin Durant, but maybe more of a Dirk or a KG and keep the game simple, until Victor simplifies the game so he can use that 7'5" advantage, he's not going to be a great offensive player. I think Chet, while he isn't Victor defensively, is an all defensive caliber big, and he's hyper efficient offensively, which I think in a contender environment, he's better suited than Victor. People can keep saying, what if Victor's in OKC? And I think that's fair. They'd probably win a lot of games with Victor. But Chet Holmgren, what he does as a number 2, I think is easier just to plant in than Victor, because you have to deal with some of the maintenance with Victor's amazing reputation and let him do a lot of the things that would probably, let's just be honest, hurt OKC's offensive efficiency. So that's my case of why Chet's better right now. It doesn't mean Victor is going to stay worse than Chet long term. It has nothing to do with that. But right now, Chet is a better player, which I think is the surprise going into the season.
It's definitely a surprise to a degree. I think it kind of just reemphasizes how Chet is one of the most NBA-ready players we've ever seen. Offensively, he's kind of a complete number 2. And I believe if you gave him a little bit more opportunity and in a situation where there wasn't so many different options, that there's no doubt that Chet could easily average 22.5 points a game while still being a high-level defender. And for Oklahoma City, it's really an example of there is not a young NBA core I've seen with a deeper nucleus of talent than this current Oklahoma City Thunder.
True.
You look at their starting lineup, obviously no Isaiah Hartenstein to start the year, but I'll lump him into this group when he is back into the lineup. You have an MVP candidate in Shea, a top 5 player in my book. You have
Mhm.
Jalen Williams, Chet Holmgren, Isaiah Hartenstein, and then Lou Dort rounding out that 5. After you get past that starting lineup, you have a bench which consists of Kaysen Wallace, a top 10 pick who's really thrived in his opportunity. After Kaysen, it is a list of players who I believe could start on other teams, but in Oklahoma City are limited to roles of 22 points a game. Alex Caruso, 30 years old. You don't have to include him to that group. That's fine. Isaiah Joe, one of the best shooters in the NBA. Aaron Wiggins would start on, I believe, 12 NBA teams and be a really good fifth starter. In Oklahoma City, he's their third guy off the bench.
Yeah.
Then you've got AJ Mitchell, who I believe is one of the biggest steals in this recent draft class. He's another young guy who I look at as super polished at the guard position, has a variety of moves in his bag, and a good enough shot at multiple levels and crafty finishing to really be, I believe, a potential guard of the future. The same way that Trey Mann the last couple of years in Oklahoma City was barely in their rotation or out of it. And the moment he gets sent to Charlotte, he's immediately become a six-man of the year candidate and one of the most fun players to watch. After those guys, you've got Dylan Jones, who I liked in the draft. So now we're looking at 10 guys. We haven't mentioned Nikola Topic, who would have been a top 5 pick if it weren't for a torn ACL. He's going to wait a year, the same way Chet did not play as a rookie. Ousmane Dieng, he was a lottery pick who hasn't really developed or shown much. I believe part of him struggling in summer league and limited opportunities he's gotten is there's just not enough of an emphasis on the talent and the development of your 12th best player. And I think for Oklahoma City, they've prioritized all of these other players to where they're just dripping with this young, they're kind of inundated, I should say, with how many different 22 to 24-year-olds who are all going to contribute to some team or more importantly, have the upside to be a rotation player. You just look down the board with this team and they have, to me, what I believe is the deepest nucleus of young talent and the longest runway to building a contender in NBA history.
I think you're 100% right. We had the conversation, is this the deepest team in recent NBA history? And I think there's 2 categories of this conversation.
Right.
Like day one, right now, how good are these players right now? Is this the deepest team in recent NBA history? I would say no. I would still honestly take the Celtics right now.
86 with Bill Walton coming off the bench.
Yep, that team, I think the Warriors, before the money kind of took away what they could build around, KD, Steph, Clay, all those guys is up there. There's a few teams I would take in terms of overall quality from roster 1 to 8. And some of it is just because players 1, 2, and 3 on the top of those teams I just mentioned are freaking awesome. Yeah. But in terms of like young talent right now and the flexibility to keep growing, we've never seen this. Because just look at this year's NBA draft. Granted, one of the deeper drafts in NBA history, right? They certainly have the Los Angeles Clippers first round pick, and that is without Kawhi Leonard playing. I would say the Clippers have overachieved so far to start the year, but that could still end up being a pretty valuable pick. I'm pretty sure if Philly's pick isn't top 6, that also belongs to OKC, right?
Yes. And then after this year, it's top 4 and then top 2 protected.
Yep. So they might very well have 2 solid 2025 first-round picks. They have Nikola Topic, who at one point I had number 1 in my draft board last year, just healing on the bench. And you mentioned Ajay Mitchell. You mentioned Dylan Jones, who looked awesome in the summer league, looked good in the preseason. And then you consider all the young talent they have right now. It's the deepest young team in NBA history. And with the CBA, the way the second apron's going to go, they're going to have to get rid of some of these guys. Well, great. Right. They still have how many first-round picks to deal? How many young players are still emerging who won't be making anything? How many of these guys are going to be like the Isaiah Joes and they're going to sign for $10 million and be worth way more than that? OKC's in the best position in the NBA right now for sustainable success. It's not close. Not close at all, because they'll always have first-round picks to trade, and they'll always have young players who are going to plug in because they got one of the best development staffs in the NBA. They're unbelievable.
Right. You don't think it's close with the T-Wolves or the Celtics?
I'm always going to –
Or the picks that much more valuable?
Wolves propaganda. I would say Minnesota is the closest in terms of Tim Connolly makes the most out of draft assets,
Mhm.
and
Brad
they
Stevens, I
have
think, will.
they have 4 to 5 really good 25 and under players in the rotation right now, and they have Terrence Shannon, Rob Dillingham just waiting there.
Yep.
Leonard Miller. They Minnesota's the second
LNG.
team, but Minnesota doesn't have these first round picks to deal. They
Yep.
might end up losing Julius Randle for nothing this summer. Minnesota just doesn't have quite the same. Like they'll have plug-in guys and they'll be fine, but
Right.
OKC, you can argue every loss will be lateral for them. Minnesota, you'll say, yeah, it's a slight loss, and you hope these guys prove what they're worth, which I think they might be worth. OKC, it's a no-brainer to me. Like they have their 3 core guys, and everybody else comes in, comes out. Minnesota's core 3 guys, one's 23, one's 32, and one's 31. So it's a little different. OKC is in a better position, but I would say Minnesota's probably 2. San
Mhm.
Antonio might get there with a good draft pick this year, but yeah, I would say right now OKC is in the best position for sustainable success in any team in the NBA right now, and arguably in NBA history, despite the second aprons.
Right. I want to hear what you had to say with the T Wolves. Being that's your team. I still think Boston though has every bit, not the timetable and like the extended runway that the Thunder have, because they just have more young talent. But
Yeah,
the next 3 to 4 years, I believe the Celtics have that same exact quality because of their top 4,
next
which
3-4 years, yeah.
I think is better. Al Horford retires, fine. You have a laundry list of young guys off that bench, and I think Brad Stevens also done a fantastic job at the end of the draft. I think Baylor Shireman will be a decent rotation
Me
player,
too.
and they've gotten guys like Xavier Tillman, Sam Hauser to either develop or you find them for cheap prices, and those guys play like really important niche roles to where they're like valuable rotation players to half the teams in the league.
No, I totally agree with you. I just think that I think going forward, I think Boston is the team that in the very short term is the team, and they have solid players. I think Minnesota's prospects are better than Boston's prospects long term, and
Yeah,
I think we'll see like where Drew Holiday and Derek White and honestly KP will be in 3 years. That's the question for me. I think
yeah,
Boston has the best immediate future, but I just think that OKC's they know who their guys are, and they're gonna be flipping guys in, flipping guys out. And the only exception to that idea is if they decide to put all their chips in for Giannis Antetokounmpo, and maybe that's the exception. But I think that's a pretty favorable exception. Tommy, sorry,
nice Tommy
Mike.
appearance. I forgot to
Yeah,
mention Peyton Pritchard, who
he's having
off
a
the
great start.
bench, 16 a game, 9 3-point attempts. He's making over 41%.
Yeah,
Al Horford with him, 45%. So
he's on fire, man.
obviously, Big Al is nearly 40 years old nowadays. But the rest of the rotation is. Oh, and I forgot to mention a prospect like Jordan Walsh, who hasn't shown a whole lot this last year, but I still have faith in the Celtic system being able to develop him when 1 or 2 guys this rotation end up leaving in free agency. So.
I wasn't a huge Walsh guy in college, but what he does have is he has length, IQ, and defense. So maybe he emerges into the I don't know, what's a comp?
Torrey Craig,
With Tory,
better defender, worse shooter.
yeah,
That
maybe
caliber of
like a
rotation
wing,
player.
more of a wing version of Kyle Anderson at the high end, maybe. Um, Anderson, his playmaking, his defense and length will always be what calls his number.
Yeah.
Walsh obviously isn't as slow as he is, but I think that's what they hope. Tatum's young, Brown is young, and then they have a good. Like I said, I think Boston's immediate future looks the best right now, but
Right.
OKC, their long term, I think they're up there, and I think probably following them is like Minnesota, San Antonio, Orlando. Obviously, I think Orlando we need to talk about in this conversation too. Even though I'm not huge on Anthony Black, even though he's had moments this year,
Has had
I'm
moments.
I'm not huge on him. I love Suggs. Wagner, I'm starting to get a little worried about if he's going to stagnate.
Right.
Um,
I think the Cavaliers have to be that next team you name after the T-Wolves.
yeah, they're up there. I think Okoro will start playing better soon.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he's not the leading conversation of that Cavs young core, but he's there.
Yeah, the
Mobley,
Cavs.
Garland, obviously. I like Jalen Tyson a lot. I think he's
Mhm.
actually I think he's a player 2-3 years down the road. We'll be looking at like, oh, wait, he's averaging 14, 4, and 4 on the bench. Whoa, good job, Cleveland.
Right.
I can see that.
Right.
So,
The Cavs and the Mavs are those next two teams to round out the 5. So
yep.
you've got Oklahoma City, Boston, Minnesota, and then those two.
Mavericks fans swear to me that Derek Lively is Shaquille O'Neal. So he better be to stay in those conversations. But yeah, as you see, he was ranked 56 on ESPN's Top 100, which I believe is higher than guys like Chet and Cade. And
Yeah,
that
they
was
had him
nuts.
diabolically high. They also don't make lists for good reason. They just make him so people can talk about it, and that's the sole reason why they do stupid shit on it all the time.
They
Here
do
or
clout.
there.
But I
They do.
mentioned Giannis a second ago, and I think this is a pretty good time to transition. And I think this is a good last topic for the show because I want to hear what you think about this. Yeah, Milwaukee's still recovering from the Drew Holiday trade right now. And because of that, any Giannis trade runs through New Orleans. That's the reality right now. New Orleans has Milwaukee's first round pick, and the Bucks had another really terrible loss yesterday to New York. And it feels like we're trending toward this better than a 50-50 chance being the year that Giannis might want out. And if that becomes the case, they're going to have to, if they want their picks back, they have to talk to New Orleans regardless. New Orleans is going to be a big player in this. And if Milwaukee's going to be a bottom 10 team in the league, New Orleans is going to demand a lot. So I think either Giannis might end up being deeply in the conversation of going to New Orleans for a guy like Zion Williamson and some assets. And at the minimum, if that doesn't happen, I think it's going to be Giannis getting dealt and New Orleans being the third team that gets a big name in the deal. Something's going to happen through New Orleans. I just want to hear, what do you think about Giannis and the relevance of New Orleans in these conversations? And is New Orleans an underrated player in a Giannis trade circuit?
Are they an underrated player in the Giannis talks? Absolutely, because their foundation around Zion Williamson is not of a championship caliber team. I believe Zion is a top 15 player in a perfect world, but they have the supporting cast with a perfect amalgamation of shooting. You talk about Jordan Hawkins, who's been underrated this year, obviously Trey Murphy as well at the small forward spot, and then Herbert Jones, who can spearhead one of the better defenses in the NBA. You pair Herbert Jones and Giannis together with the amount of shooting that they have, and then things just start to click because you have a star player who's more durable, reliable, and then more complete with the defensive side. Giannis helps you on the glass. He helps you at the rim. He is that engine to get those shooters more looks. And I can only imagine if you're able to keep Trey Murphy and Jordan Hawkins in that deal, because let's keep in mind, that's only $9 million. Let's say you acquire Giannis. If the Pelicans were to get that caliber of a player, you're putting Zion. I think Zion would have to go in the deal. That's $36 million. At the same exact time, I think you're putting in one of CJ or DeJounte Murray just to make the money work. And then you're offering all of those first-round picks that the Bucks gave you, including some of your own. Giannis is 30 years old, and I believe that's pretty solid value for a player who will start to slowly decline in his athleticism and explosiveness around the rim. And then when that happens, we've seen this oftentimes with these physically imposing players at 32 to 33, they start to have all of their weaknesses really accentuated. This is what happened to Russell Westbrook at 34. And then slowly that player does become manageable to guard. I don't think Giannis is going to decline like Russ, but I do believe by 32, 33, he's going to dip from a top 5 player in the world to top 15. Maybe Zion talks. But the idea is he plays more games than Zion and is a more complete player even still. So I think that does make a lot of sense. And for the Pelicans, it would immediately make you a contender, I believe, if you're able to keep the shooting and then as well as Herbert Jones, because Herbert Jones and Giannis together defensively will be pretty sickening from a length and pure explosiveness standpoint. Those two would get what I feel like would be like 8 to 10 deflections every single night and just make it like a living hell for opposing teams.
Most definitely. I think you are right on pretty much all of it. I think the only question is going to be, will Giannis be more enchanted by a bigger market or a sexier franchise than New Orleans for the last part of his tenure? But as I mentioned, all those first round picks in the holiday deal, New Orleans pretty much has them, especially if you want to rebuild. You really want that 2025 first this year. You really want it because it's a good draft. I'm not going to say it's 2018. I'm not going to say it's 03, but it's a good draft.
This upcoming
And
draft class can be 2018 good.
It could be. I'm still figuring out how much I like the top guys. I like them a lot, but I think I don't. I mean, Cooper Flag to me, I still think Luka as a prospect was a step above Cooper Flag. I'm trying to think: is he more of a, maybe a Ben Simmons caliber number one pick, which is really good, but not, a generational number one. So that's gonna be the question. But the depth is no question. But if, like I said, going back to the point, New Orleans has all those picks, and like you said, the shooting, the length, the versatility, the depth. I think they have a good coach in
Yep.
Willie Green. Those are all good things. And lastly, the biggest problem with the New Orleans experiment right now is you want Zion to be a five offensively, but defensively, he so obviously can't play the five because he
Yep.
can't rebound well enough. He's not big enough. But you have Giannis as this bigger Zion. You put him in there at that five position, which you can do in the modern NBA, like a Chet in OKC, and you space the floor at. You let him anchor the defense in the interior and in the
Mhm.
outside, and you give him this spacing, and you keep at least one secondary creator in DeJounte and Brandon Ingram, and you give
Yeah.
up the other and some other things. New Orleans has as good of an environment
Right.
as you could ever want, and I think if you're a New Orleans fan, you can apply all of those dreams of Zion Williamson into Giannis at the five, and you don't have to worry about the five position anymore. And you
Right.
could probably play Murphy, Herb, and Ingram together in those circumstances.
Mhm.
It makes everything so much smoother. And in Milwaukee, you get all those assets back, and Zion's a pretty good building block to start with. So I think there's a lot of reasons to like it for both sides. I truly believe the Giannis trade rumors is going to run through New Orleans. However, extent New Orleans gets into the Giannis conversation.
And I think the best part about it is that I believe that Brandon Ingram will be gone for into. If you keep CJ McCollum, his game's going to age well into his 30s. He's one of the NBA's best shooters. He's a great second, the third shot creator. You're putting three elite shooters next to Giannis. And then if he's Misi develops, I don't think stylistically he's a burly enough kind of five for Giannis to play the four. But even still, they could play together to where I think the Pelicans would solve a lot of their problems. If you offer Zion, three firsts, two firsts, one of which is Milwaukee's own. And then on top of that, you add in that expiring deal of a DeJounte. Maybe it's a Brandon Ingram. That would be a lot because, in theory, you re-sign Brandon Ingram for the Bucks.
Mm-hmm.
You get BIs out and multiple first-round picks, Giannis. If you're at the bottom of the Eastern Conference standings and your team is one of the oldest in the NBA, it's one of the most disappointing. It makes a whole lot of sense to start your rebuild that way because that would be an absolute hole for Giannis. At the same exact time, though, the Bucks won't trade him until Giannis does request a trade. And there's a possibility that Giannis has all of this bulk for the last year. He had a soft trade request launch. That could just be him flexing his only possible power of making this roster better. And ultimately, he'll never request a trade, maybe like a Dirk Nowitzki, and he stays his entire career at the team that drafted him. I think that is a pretty real possibility, maybe a 33% chance. And I wouldn't really fault Giannis one bit for that because he has a championship and he really has already proven everything in his NBA career. I don't know how much more a second title would change the way we look at him. And more importantly, might just be happy in Milwaukee as well.
I would be shocked if that is how it transpires, though, because I think when you're that good and how crazy hard Giannis got to where he got,
Right.
I just think he has. I don't think it's in his nature to just kind of sit back and say, you know what, I'm just going to ride my days in mediocre Milwaukee, right? And I'm saying not Milwaukee, the city being mediocre. I haven't been to Milwaukee very often, but
Mhm.
just the organizational status. Yeah, Giannis flexed all those trade ideas to keep going after and seeing what they can also get. That's why they got Damian Lillard. But mentioning Damian Lillard, first of all, let's talk about Dame because
He's been
he
cooking
kept
a little
he
bit.
kept doing those soft requests. He kept saying, "I love New Portland. I love Portland. I love Portland." And there's a certain day where I think everybody reaches the conclusion it's not going to work out. I think Kevin Garnett in Minnesota had a very similar situation. These guys, when they're not in positions to win in the 30s, like Stephen Curry was, likely don't ride out those days. And Giannis has thrown enough soft trade requests that make me believe that there's some legitimacy into those ideas. In Milwaukee, let's just be honest, they're basically pulled of all the options that they can possibly use because this is the core that these assets has turned into. So
Right.
I expect, honestly, at this point, Giannis to want out at some point in Milwaukee. once they get to that point, you just have to maximize the assets to get in return, which, as I keep going back to, will be pointless if they can't get those first-round picks back, like kind of like what Brooklyn did with KD and stuff like that. So
In 3 years, you look at the Bucks' outlook. Chris Middleton will be 36 years old. He get to play a game this year. He has what some would even say a chronic knee issue. Brooke Lopez will be 40 years old. Bobby Portis will be 32. He doesn't really fit this current team at all. He's been underperforming. After Giannis and what would be a 37-year-old Damian Lillard, the next best player in that team, if this is their current roster, that might be Andre Jackson, who plays 15 minutes a game, because the rest of this roster is minimum contracts like Taurean Prince, Gary Trent Jr. Gary Trent's been shooting 23% from the three, is not finding the rhythm at all. So I do think if it gets to that point where you literally have two starters next to Giannis and the rest are non-playable rotation players right out the group, then it kind of makes too much sense to request a trade, and then the Bucks have no choice other than not to. So that is also a distinct possibility when they've missed on all their draft picks, and
they missed every pick.
there's no middle class in the NBA at all. You don't have guys who are making $20 to $22 million to kind of manage that in between of superstars making 40 million to 35, and then your minimum contract players. So I think that's also the Bucks are kind of suffering from too.
No, exactly. I mean, we mentioned Denver, like maybe they could have drafted better late, but Milwaukee's on a whole nother level of dysfunction in the draft. I think we mentioned the list last week. It was like, who was the guy they drafted in 2017 that looks like Lonzo
Dante
Ball?
DiVincenzo.
No, not Dante. Dante is the only good
18. 17 might have been DJ Wilson.
DJ Wilson, yeah. I actually, my friend ran into him at the Mall of America and thought he was Lonzo Ball and they called him Lonzo Ball.
Lonzo Ball looking 7 feet tall with dreads. I don't know.
I don't know. When you're 15 years old, though, and 6'6" and 7 feet are all really tall.
Right.
So that was part of it. It was during the Super Bowl time in Minneapolis. So early 2018. I wasn't even 15 yet. So yeah, dude. I mean, it's gonna be very interesting to see how Milwaukee kind of channels all this, especially how would they deal with Dame if Giannis wants out, who would trade a lot for Dame? That's going to be a question. Like, I think the obvious team who would want Dame is Miami. Just wait until his value goes down and then bite, right?
Yeah.
So it could be one of those scenarios as well to pair him with Bam.
And they get him for cheap price.
Yeah. Is there any thoughts you have regarding this idea or no?
No, not quite. But the Bucks have drafted a lot worse when you look deeper into it. They took DJ Wilson at number 17. Later in that draft, Jared Allen went at 22. OG Anunoby went at 23. Kyle Kuzma went at 27. Derek White went at 29. Josh Hart went at 30. Even John Collins went 2 picks later. He was someone who I was like, this guy should be an automatic lottery pick with how productive he was his second year at Wake Forest. And he felt quite a bit.
I loved him.
Atlanta's lap. And yeah, like that's one of those final picks before you become a contender, which you really need to hit on. That's when the Nuggets struck gold taking Michael Porter Jr. or let's say the Miami Heat finding Bam Adebayo and Tyler Hero. Those mid to late first round picks right before you're stuck with a bottom 5 pick every single draft class. And I think that's something the Bucks really did miss a lot of meat on the bone. So
yeah, it's bad. And there's also another layer to it where these players are so impressionable and it's up to your organization to develop them. And after the early 2010 windows of Bucks draft picks, Giannis, getting Middleton from Detroit, some of those young prospects, they haven't developed anybody. And that has to be, I believe that teams aren't only terrible drafters, but they're as much as terrible developing these players because all these guys who get drafted this high have talent. They do. So it can't be all 100% these guys just suck. It can't be.
Right. And they got talent with Dante DiVincenzo, and they traded him for Serge Ibaka.
Yeah, exactly. It's just they haven't been patient with young players, and it feels like they're trying to get out of the financial loophole of these guys on rookie contract extensions too. There's a lot of issues with Milwaukee, which is why they're not going to push forward on the Giannis window. I already think it's closed. I think it closed last year, and I think that's just the reality. It's not a good team right now, and they don't defend well enough. And I don't know what they do. I really don't know. I think this is all kind of leading to the inevitable. So
Yeah. Should be interesting.
It'll be very interesting. I feel like I like Milwaukee, so I hate hating on them all the time, but here we are. But yeah, I think that's all we have for today's show. This is Objectively Biased. We'll be back next week, most likely with our boy Riv. And
certainly with Riv.
Most certainly with Riv. And down the road, as we keep doing these shows, we appreciate the support we've already received on social media, Instagram, TikTok.
They've running up the likes in that first TikTok. I want that to continue. I think it will continue.
Yeah, and it's our job to bring good content to you guys, so we'll try to keep doing that. And yeah,